This week on Listening to America, here's your podcast introduction. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Just got off the Zoom meeting with Rebecca Flynt and, of course, Lindsay Chervinsky. The subject was 10 things about Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris, the New York-born bon vivant, one leg, peg leg, apparently in a sexual escapade. His leg was crushed, either jumping out of a window or it had something to do with a carriage. And this became a kind of a badge of honor for him, if you can imagine. And it didn't slow him down. He was in Europe for about a decade. In fact, he followed Jefferson as the minister to France. He still was wildly successful with women of all classes. And he writes in his voluminous diaries as if he were James Boswell. And if you've never read Boswell's journals, they're amongst the most, sexed up escapades that we have from anyone's journals except the work of Casanova. So Gouverneur Morris, also the penman of the Constitution, he wrote the famous preamble to the Constitution. He was a friend to Alexander Hamilton and gave the eulogy after Hamilton's unfortunate death in 1804 on the dueling grounds of New Jersey. A founding father that deserves to be much better known. And so this is a program about that. And a few weeks ago, Lindsay got an email from a listener by the name of Rebecca Flynt, and she said that she had been listening to a Hamilton program and had some thoughts about the famous Maria Reynolds scandal. But she also knows a great deal about the events at Bizarre, the love triangle between Nancy Randolph and Richard Randolph and John Randolph of Roanoke, and her pregnancy and either the abortion or the infanticide or the stillbirth or whatever it was, and the scandal that came out of all of this. And Jefferson's daughter Patsy was peripherally involved and devastated by the shame of all of this, and maybe had a role in it. Well, you can hear that in the program too. It's fascinating material. So Lindsay and I asked Rebecca to come on, and she was on for the second segment and for a little bit at the end of the third segment of this really, really interesting program. One of my favorites about Gouverneur Morris. It's amazing that he isn't better known. I've got a couple of biographies of him, but I'm going to now get his diary. Unfortunately, they're extremely expensive, but it sounds like if you're interested in this era, and I am deeply, deeply interested in James Boswell, who wrote the magisterial biography of Dr. Samuel Johnson, maybe the best biography ever written. And a similar man about town, let's call it. Lots of alcohol, lots of women, lots of intrigue, and some scandal. So this is really strange, and as I say in the program, the best named plantation in history is Bizarre, which was the actual name of the plantation where this scandal began to unfold. And Thomas Jefferson then, when his daughter was just overwhelmed with shame that she was even related to such people, said to her, "At no point does this woman need your support." This is Nancy Randolph, the woman whose baby was either aborted or stillborn. At no point does she need friendship more than now. That this is, you need to step up. Yes, it's no fun. And yes, you're ashamed. But it's not about you. And poor Nancy, poor Anne, is now alone in the universe, and you must rise to the occasion of reaching out to her and comforting her. Jefferson believed that Richard was the culprit, and that he was fully to blame for seducing her or preying upon her in some way or other in order to get her pregnant. So it's one of the handful of the greatest letters Jefferson ever wrote. You can see it in any edition of Jefferson's works. So let's go to the program. Again, just weeks now before I start the great journey. The details are starting to gel. It's going to be absolutely amazing. We want you involved. Go to the website, ltamerica.org. Sign up for the newsletter. Help us if you can. This is one of the biggest undertakings of my life. I feel that I've been waiting for this moment for decades, really. And now I'm going to have the enormous joy of traveling America in an Airstream and listening to America for the next 4 or 5 or 6 or even 7 years. And we definitely want you to be a part of it. So thanks for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Listening to America. I have the pleasure of sitting virtually across from my friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Today's subject, 10 things about Gouverneur Morris. Now, Gouverneur Morris was not a governor. That's just an interesting sort of weird pun of names in the 18th and early 19th century. He was a big figure at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, maybe the closest friend of Alexander Hamilton, a good friend of George Washington, an American diplomat abroad, a man about town, a kind of a playboy, a brilliant prose stylist, and much more. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you. I think this is going to be a very fun episode. Fun little side tangent about his name. When I first started my dissertation, I had my husband read all of my stuff at the time to edit it. I no longer ask him to do that, but initially I did.
He's out. He
was like, is this a typo? Because his name is so unfamiliar to 21st century audiences.
That's when you fired him. 10 things about Gouverneur Morris. So let's begin with this one. Why is he neglected in histories of the early national period? I did a fair amount of reading about him in the last couple of weeks, Lindsay, when we chose this topic. He's utterly fascinating. He's quite important. He's at many of the most important incidents and events of this era. Why has he been ignored as much as he has?
I think there are a couple of reasons. I think that he never served as a president or a vice president in the early years. He was never a governor of a state, especially on a big state. So that tends to, or a chief justice or a Supreme Court justice. So those are sometimes the positions we do tend to remember. He did spend much of the 1790s abroad, and we are not, as Americans, as generally familiar with our foreign policy history as we are with our domestic history. I think his later life also maybe put him in a little bit of ill repute. He turned away from Congress. He didn't want to serve after 1800 because he felt like Congress was kind of miserable. And although he was supportive of Jefferson's acquisition of Louisiana, he later then was very, very much against the War of 1812 and was supportive of the idea of secession and the Hartford Convention. And so that's not a great legacy. And a lot of the people who were involved with that have not been particularly celebrated.
Well, that makes sense, I guess. I suppose some Puritans amongst our historians have also been a little unclear of how to handle the womanizing. He was...
Doesn't stop them from liking JFK, though, does it?
No, it doesn't. But he had many mistresses, and if we take him seriously, he was essentially like James Boswell, that his eye was always looking for his next conquest. He was very successful at it. He writes somewhat explicitly about some of the liaisons he had in Europe, to the point that some of his diary pages have actually been torn out by somebody, presumably his descendants. So we don't know the full details, but it's pretty colorful stuff. Let's put it that way. What most people know about him, Lindsay, who know anything about him, is that he had a peg leg, that he had an amputation. And the story has always been that he said that he got it by trying to escape from a carriage when an angry husband was trying to attack him, and that his leg somehow got caught and got infected and it had to be amputated. Is that true, and how do we know?
My understanding is that he injured his leg in a carriage accident. Now, maybe the story was made more colorful later on, that I had heard that he told it as he jumped out a window onto the top of the carriage to try and escape the husband who had unexpectedly come home, which is certainly more colorful and lends credence to his reputation as a man about town, as you said.
Born in 1752 in New York to a prominent colonial family, attended Columbia, then known as King's College. After Columbia, he went to England, as many people did, especially from that part of the country, to study the law at the Inns of Court. He returned to the United States just in time in 1775 for the Revolution, and at first was skeptical about the revolutionary cause, but got on board. Then we sort of skipped forward to the Constitutional Convention, where he was not only an important figure, one of the people who spoke often and spoke really well, but he also made a famous speech late in the process attacking slavery. I think that's one of the most important things that he ever did. What do you know about this?
Yes, well, let me give two other little tiny tidbits in his backstory that I think we will circle back to. So he did serve, even despite the fact that he had one leg and was a member of the legislature, so he could have avoided service. He did serve in the Continental Army, which is where he met Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. So those are pretty important relationships that we're going to circle back to. At the Constitutional Convention, he was pretty vehemently anti-slavery in a way few people were. And I think this is important because, we often talk about the context of the time. So just for understanding the proper context, his ideas about slavery came up especially in regards to the 3/5 clause. So this was the compromise that counted 5 Black Americans as 3 Americans for the purposes of apportioning population for representation in Congress and in the Electoral College. And so what he said was he could either, when he was trying to figure out how to work with the South on this, he said he was reduced to the dilemma of doing injustice to the Southern states or to human nature, and he must therefore do it to the former. And when they were debating this 3/5 clause, this language is so unbelievably, remarkably modern, and so I think it's worth hearing. He said, upon what principle is it that the slaves should be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in this city, meaning Philadelphia, are worth more than all the wretched slaves which cover the rice swamps of South Carolina.
Let me go on with that speech, which I think is amazing. Still amazing. Of course, this would have appalled all the Southern delegates to the Constitutional Convention. They had already made it clear that if there were any significant assault on their favorite institution, that they would walk out and they would refuse to be part of the process. So they, in a sense, were holding up the whole beginning, the Charter of the United States, to protect slavery. And everyone understood this, but Morris was not just going to let it go. So just after the part that you read, he says, the admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa, and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections, and damns them to the most cruel bondage, shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizens of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice. He goes on, I would add that domestic slavery is the most prominent feature in the aristocratic countenance of the proposed Constitution. So not only does it perpetuate slavery, which is in direct violation of everything that the American Republic is supposed to represent, but it also brings in an aristocratic feature, as if certain people, Southern whites, have special status under our social compact. That's an amazing speech, and I will always think well of him because of it and for other reasons.
Yeah, and I think there are 2 additional components which are worth acknowledging. One, he was not opposed to social hierarchy per se. I know we're going to talk more about his ideas about the Senate, and he believed that there was a merit-based aristocratic system that made sense for the United States. So, if the best men could rise to the top, that was a good thing. It was this ingrained economic hierarchy that smacked of the British system that he was in opposition to.
And he wrote the preamble. He wrote the famous preamble to the Constitution of the United States, which is one of the most important documents in and of itself, even before we get to Article 1 of that instrument.
His contributions to the Constitution are incredible and numerous, and he's often known as the penman of the Constitution, whereas James Madison is called the father of the Constitution. And the idea is that James Madison was behind a lot of the big ideas, but Morris was behind the crafting of the language. So he did a couple of things that I think are worth noting. He was there early, and so he played a very formative role in helping Edmund Randolph submit the initial plan, which had the 3-part plan to create this new system, and that was what really got the conversation going. He then spoke more than anyone else, so he gave 173 speeches that summer. Perhaps he made his most impactful long-term contribution, which was changing the opening from we the states and listing the states to we the people of the United States.
It became a constitution for the people of the United States, not for the citizens of South Carolina and the citizens of Pennsylvania and New York. We need to take a break here in a minute. Let's do an easy one. He and Alexander Hamilton made a bet about whether one of them would dare to touch the shoulder of George Washington. Tell us what happened, Lindsay.
Right. So the bet was that one of them would go up and basically smack Washington on the back as a hello.
Or just touch him.
Touch him and say, like, hi, buddy, hi, pal type of concept. Not that language, obviously. That's 21st century language. But a very informal greeting. And apparently Gouverneur Morris took this bet and agreed to go up and do it. And when he had his hand on Washington's back, Washington just turned and looked at him and said nothing and had a complete, stone face, which he was pretty good at. And Gouverneur Morris slowly withdrew his hand and walked away. And it must have been one of the most awkward moments because it didn't go over very well.
I love this story. It says a lot about everybody. It says something about Alexander Hamilton, who was probably watching this with great amusement from the side. It wasn't Hamilton who was going to do this, it was Gouverneur Morris.
Oh, yeah, totally. And you can imagine, they're the two type of people. You could not let them sit together at an event because they would just get into so much trouble. They would just be rabble-rousers the whole time. And so I love that story.
I do too. And one way that I've heard this is that Washington turned and gave him a stony look and then actually took his hand and removed Gouverneur Morris. Is that true? I hope it's true.
I don't know. I've heard a lot of different, these stories, they're kind of apocryphal. So who knows exactly how it happened. But either way, I think the general sense of his response is probably pretty accurate because most people did not touch Washington and he did not welcome physical closeness from many.
One does not touch George Washington. George Washington did not shake hands with the American people. George Washington bowed at his levees. He didn't quite know what a president was supposed to be in our republic. Nobody did. And he played it a little more in tune with the old monarchical habits than people like Mr. Jefferson could stand.
I give Washington a lot more leeway than Jefferson did in terms of his proto-monarchical habits in the beginning, trying to figure out how it worked.
We need to take a short break. We're talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about 10 things regarding Gouverneur Morris, the great New York bon vivant, friend to Hamilton, friend to George Washington, distinguished American diplomat, great prose stylist. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to the special edition of Listening to America. Lindsay, we have a special guest, somebody who is a long-term listener to our programs, who knows something about this subject of Gouverneur Morris. So please welcome her.
Yes, well, thank you. So it is my pleasure to include in this conversation Rebecca Flynt. Rebecca reached out to me after we did our episode on Jefferson and Hamilton, and we were talking about whether or not Jefferson knew about the Reynolds pamphlet before it was published, and shared some wonderful research with me and shared about her project that she's working on. And we thought it would be interesting to have her come on and talk a little bit about Anne, also known as Nancy Randolph Morris, and give a little bit about her life. We talked briefly about Nancy when we did the John Randolph episode. We talked about the scandal at Bazaar. But so first, Rebecca, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited for this conversation. So just a brief recap for those who haven't listened to the Randolph episode, and definitely go back because we did delve into this subject in more detail in that conversation. But so for a brief recap, Anne was living at Bazaar, which was the family home of the Randolphs, with her sister and her sister's husband. At some point, Nancy, Anne, what do you recommend we call her? What name did she prefer?
So when she was born, Anne Carey Randolph, after her mother, but obviously they called her Nancy because, the Randolphs had this crazy habit of naming their children after themselves. She went by Nancy up until she married Gouverneur. And as soon as she married him, she began signing her letters Anne Carey Morris.
Yeah, that is interesting. Okay, so while she was referred to as Nancy, she was at Bazaar. At some point, she became pregnant. The story seems to be that she had a relationship with her brother-in-law. At some point, this baby was born. Whether or not it was a stillbirth or a miscarriage, we don't know. The baby did not survive in some fashion. There was evidence that the baby had been placed outside. It became a very scandalous trial. She was acquitted of wrongdoing, and it had a connection to Jefferson because his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, testified at the trial. How is that summary in terms of basic facts?
It's a fascinating story. I mean, I would recommend anybody interested in 17th century scandals, this is a doozy. So, and I think you said in the John Randolph episode that, people were not less scandalous than they are now. There was some pretty crazy stuff going on. So she was the daughter. She and Judith were the daughters of Thomas Mann Randolph. So their mother died when Anne and Judith were 15 and 17. And he very quickly married Gabriella Harvey, who completely ostracized the rest of the children. And Clay could speak to this because Martha Patsy talked to her father a lot about it in letters. She proceeded to have a son, which she renamed Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., who inherited Tuckahoe, their family plantation. So she did not get along with her new stepmother, who was her age. Her sister, who by this time was married to their cousin, Richard Randolph, it was a family tradition. They married cousins. And there was also another brother there, though. There was 3 brothers, and they were the sons of Francis Bland Randolph and John Randolph. Their father died when they were very young, and she married St. George Tucker, who is a famous lawyer there in Williamsburg. He taught at William and Mary, and he was a great stepfather. He tried, but there were 3 brothers. Richard was the oldest, and he married Judith at 19. And then he had another brother, Theodoric, and then John, the youngest, John Randolph of Roanoke. At some point, all of the brothers were there at Bazaar. Now, supposedly, she was engaged to the middle brother, Theodoric, but there's some question about that. They didn't seem to announce it to anybody outside the household. They didn't seem to indicate it. And at one point, John, he was in school, and I think he was at Columbia, or else, King's College at the time. So I think he was writing her letters, trying to court her. So at one point, all 3 brothers were after her, and she writes a letter to her father and basically says, "Can y'all come get me? Can y'all send a carriage?" And Gabriella intercepts the letter and writes back, "All the horses are lame. We can't come get you." So they kind of left her in this pretty awkward position with these 3 brothers, all of whom were pursuing her.
After the scandal happens, she remains there for a while, and then she's eventually kicked out of the house. And so can you tell us, how does she meet, because the episode we're doing is on Gouverneur Morris, so we want to know more about that relationship. How does she meet him?
So Richard, who was tried for killing her baby and acquitted, she goes back to live with him and Judith. He dies 3 years later, under some strange circumstances. She remains there so John Randolph of Roanoke is now the only living son, and he kind of takes over the plantation Bazaar. And he kicks her out about 6 years later, I think around 1800. He kicks her out, and she tries to contact her brothers, William and Tom Jr., but they're not super helpful. She goes to Richmond. She ends up going to Connecticut. She ends up being kind of a companion to an older lady. And she reaches out to Gouverneur at that time. She's in pretty desperate circumstances because she had met him years earlier at Tuckahoe. He had been there and stayed with Thomas Mann Randolph at Tuckahoe during the ratification debates of the Constitution. Long time ago. She had been a child. She reaches out to him, and we're not quite sure, but they begin a correspondence. At this time, he's going to be gone, but they kind of talk back and forth, and he decides, I think he was probably pretty interested in her, but he decides that he wants to offer her a job as a housekeeper, somebody intelligent, well-educated, but yet not marriageable. Because of the scandal and being kicked out, she just wasn't marriageable. So they begin this correspondence. It's very sweet, and it's pretty clear he's pursuing her. It's pretty sweet. She apparently, at the beginning, tells him about the scandal. We don't know exactly the details of what she tells him, but she tells him because he says, she's told me everything. They kind of negotiate this housekeeper thing back and forth, and it's pretty clear that she's thinking that he's got something else in mind. So he assures her, no, I've never had a relationship with my housekeepers. I will be respectful. But it's pretty clear he is courting her. So he goes and gets her, and Gouverneur Morris has the most wonderful, diary. He writes in his diary, April of 1809, he says, brought home Miss Randolph of Virginia. So he goes and picks her up at this boarding house where she's staying with this older lady. And within 6 months, they're married. Very, very sweet story. Interesting story about the marriage is Gouverneur actually reaches out to John Marshall before he asked her to marry him, because John Marshall had been her attorney. He's wanting to know exactly. So he reaches out to John Marshall, and we still have those letters. And John Marshall writes them back very carefully worded letter, and says, I don't remember much about it. There didn't seem to be a lot of evidence that, she'd even been pregnant. But the fact that her sister continued to live with her, allow her to live with them, tells me that there was nothing to it, that she was innocent.
All right, let me pick up a couple of very rapid answer questions, please, Rebecca. Do you think that Richard was the father of her child?
I do, and the family apparently thought that.
Do you think the child was aborted? Do you think the child was murdered? Do you think the child was stillborn?
Yeah.
Was the child hidden amongst a woodpile?
So I think probably it was, of course, middle of the night. I think Richard panicked. They were not at home. They were visiting another family member. They were visiting Randolph Harrison and his wife, Mary. I think this baby was born. It was dead. What to do. And I think he runs downstairs, and I think he hides it under the shingles to deal with it the next morning. I mean, this is where, we're talking about a 21-year-old man and a 18-year-old woman. It was not the best of looks, but I think that's what happened.
Another question I have for you is, Richard dies in mysterious circumstances. Some people believe that he was poisoned. Was he poisoned, and if so, by whom?
This is something I go back and forth on. John Randolph of Roanoke, and he says it later after she marries Gouverneur, that he felt like she poisoned him. I don't know. That's one thing in my research that's really, I think, personally, that he was poisoned. I think the sexual relationship, I do think Richard was the father of her baby. By all family letters, by the time she gets pregnant, Theodoric is so sick he can't even get out of bed.
All right, so another question I have for you, Rebecca, is about Martha. So Thomas Jefferson's eldest daughter, his beloved daughter, Patsy, was very upset by this whole scandal and didn't know if she could ever raise her head again. And Jefferson wrote her a beautiful letter saying that poor Anne never needed a friend more than at this time, and that's when we must really step up. One of the best letters that he ever wrote. But Martha testified in this celebrity trial that John Marshall, Patrick Henry, this was a celebrity trial of the century kind of trial. I just read the other day that Patsy may have given Anne a powder that's an abortifacient, that she may have supplied her with a gum that was used to cause spontaneous abortion?
It was a resin. Yeah, gum resin. I actually had a lot of questions about that. So I was able to obtain a copy of a volume of John Marshall's papers with his deposition notes from that trial. Fascinating. Reading those, John Marshall was brilliant in terms of deposing them in a way, they all knew, deposing them in a way that they didn't perjure themselves. He was super careful. Martha's testimony, Patsy's testimony, was really interesting because he says, did you give her this medicine? They talked about it. And he said, I sent it to her in a small amount. And then he asked her, did you anticipate that this would be the result? And she said, no, I've known of pregnant women to be given this without any mischief at all. She also said in the deposition notes that she did suspect that Nancy was pregnant. I don't think they talked about it, but I think everybody knew.
That's a very interesting little factoid. So either Patsy was ignorant of the chemical possibilities of this resin, or she's implicit and helping her sister-in-law produce a miscarriage or an abortion. That puts the Jeffersons in this in a way that I'm not particularly comfortable with, but the testimony is the testimony. Let me jump forward now. So she winds up in New York City. Gouverneur Morris had met her earlier. He then plucks her out of this reduced circumstance, as he likes to call it, and she becomes his housekeeper, but soon enough they get married. Lindsay and I were talking about this before you came on. I'm a little creeped out by this story, Rebecca. It feels like he's a predator picking a woman who's fallen and therefore much more available than she would be if she were a gentlewoman. Am I misreading this?
I'm much more sympathetic, by the way, just so we're clear.
Oh, here we go. But please, just leaving Lindsay out for the moment, it does seem a little creepy to me. What do you think?
I don't think so. I think that Nancy was, very appealing. I think she was very pretty. She had lots of suitors before the scandal. I think she was one of those. I think she was a very vivacious, very chatty person. And I think he really liked her. I do. I think he was actively pursuing her. And I think the only way that he felt like, I think he wanted to help her. And I feel like the only way, because she was still a Randolph, she was still a gentlewoman, as he puts it, even if she was reduced. And I don't think that she would be willing to go into his household or become his mistress without a marriage. That was the way he did it. I mean, that's the way I read it. I don't know, but I'm sympathetic to him.
Well, Lindsay, let me ask you this question. One of two things is true here. If he's really courting her from the beginning, under the subterfuge of a housekeeper, that doesn't seem quite right. That's the part that just gets under my skin a little, Lindsay. I know you're going to rebuke me for this.
Well, no, I'm not going to rebuke you. I guess I see it a couple of ways. I am sympathetic to him wanting to help her because she was in such reduced circumstances. I am sympathetic to the possibility that once they were both in the same household, because they were both eminently charming in their own ways, that it evolved into something more. I also think it's possible that he maybe initially was not thinking marriage, and he did find her to be quite appealing. And so, credit to her for securing the outcome that made her respectable. We have to remember this is 18th century society. And, you and I have talked a lot about the parallels to like Jane Austen, but securing that honorable end is half the battle, more than half the battle when you're a woman.
You two knuckleheads, if this were a 21st century story, you would be all over it.
Yeah, but it wasn't.
A person seeking out fine. But everyone should read Oliver Goldsmith's great play, She Stoops to Conquer, which is about this very phenomenon. At any rate, they get married. And
they do.
Let's fast forward here, Rebecca. John Randolph, the famous John Randolph of Roanoke, eventually then does everything he can to destroy them in their reputation.
First of all, he actually surprises his guests. He actually asks her to marry him on Christmas Eve, marries them on Christmas Day, to the surprise of everyone. He does have Nancy sign a prenup. She signs a prenup before. I know.
What was it about? What did he have to have from her?
He had nephews that were, very suspicious of Nancy. And I think that was kind of to prove to them that she wasn't after his money. But yeah, so a couple of years later, so Nancy actually does have a child. She and Gouverneur have a son, a junior. And the nephews, the previously mentioned nephews, all of a sudden they've lost out on their inheritance. And they're pretty angry. So David Ogden is the main nephew. John and Ogden get together, and they have determined that Nancy's, so he writes a letter. So John Randolph of Roanoke writes a letter to Nancy in care of Gouverneur, which is really passive-aggressive, in which contains the line, "A vampire that after sucking the best blood of my race has flitted off to the north and struck her harpy fangs into an infirmed old man." That is in the letter. So Gouverneur reads this. And one of the things I just love about Gouverneur is most men, would have just immediately bowed up. And that's dual territory, right? But he didn't. He has some friends of his said you should sue him for libel. He's like, I don't need the money, kind of thing. He'll get his, basically. So he allows Nancy to respond, which I love. And she does. She responds to every single accusation and then copies the letter and sends it to 20 of his political enemies.
of John Randolph's political enemies.
Yeah, so she copies it out 20 times.
How much older was Gouverneur Morris than
He was quite a bit
Anne?
older. So he was in his 50s and she was in her 30s. And that's what I was going to say earlier. This was not some 17-year-old innocent girl. She was in her 30s by the time Gouverneur begins to court her. It makes it less creepy. And that's why I give him a lot of leeway there. And like I said, she doesn't even admit she has publicly or even privately in letters that she had a baby until after she responds to John Randolph. And she says the baby was Theodoric's, not Richard's. Now, there's some pretty good evidence that on his deathbed, Richard had made her promise that he would never admit, I don't know. I mean, we just don't know. And now I'm going to make something up in my book, what I think, but I get to do that because I'm writing fiction. So
we will wait for this book with some eagerness. Rebecca, I want to thank you. A couple things before we let you go. Number one, she must have been something. If three brothers were all after her and she was still so hot, let's use a 21st century term, that she was still attractive in spite of the scandal and the cloud to other people. I hope she poisoned Richard. Jefferson believed that Richard was the culprit. That may not be true either. She might have been central to this story. To paint her as entirely innocent, I think would be a stretch, clearly. But what strikes to me is that the best named plantation in human history is Bizarre.
Bizarre. Yep. Yeah. No, I agree, and I had to use that in the title, so I hope they let me keep it.
When you finish it, come back on the program and we'll talk about it.
Thank you. I would love to do that.
Thanks to everyone. You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America on 10 Things About Gouverneur Morris, one of which is he married the woman of the scandal at Bizarre. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America, 10 Things About Gouverneur Morris. Lindsay, what a fascinating story. I mean, there are so many parts of this. So one is, of course, the sex scandal, whatever it was at Bizarre, and we know something about that. The second thing, of course, is its connection to John Randolph of Roanoke. The third thing is that the Jeffersons are part of this story, and as I did research for this notion that Martha may have provided a rosin or a gum, which was a known abortifacient, is utterly fascinating to me, and I'm not sure quite what to make of it. And then there is Gouverneur Morris of New York, who apparently did some traveling down to Virginia from time to time, and he rescued, the way they would put it in a 19th century novel is he rescued this fallen woman and made her more respectable, and they had a successful marriage in which there was a child.
Yeah, you really can't make this stuff up. And so history is often more, to use the language, more bizarre than fiction. And that is only one small part of Gouverneur Morris's life. We haven't even gotten to his time in France, which was extraordinary, or some of his other relationships, which were very formative.
Lindsay, let's talk about Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton is killed in a duel in the summer of 1804. And he lingers for about 30 hours after he's shot by Aaron Burr at Weehawken, New Jersey. Gouverneur Morris is with him at the end. Gouverneur Morris then has the difficult challenge of giving a eulogy for Hamilton, which he did beautifully, by the way. He loved Hamilton. They had a great friendship. He does confide to his diary that this isn't going to be easy. Hamilton wasn't universally liked. There were some issues in Hamilton's character and also in his political outlook. And, says Morris, he was a monarchist. Morris just says, you know what, he was a monarchist. And that, so, Jefferson had always claimed that Hamilton was a monarchist, but normally that's beaten back by Hamilton scholars. But Morris, who knew him as well as anybody, said, yeah, it's true.
Yeah, so Morris handles the Alexander Hamilton's death, I think, with incredible sensitivity and grace. So first, his Hamilton's wife, Eliza, called him in towards the end so that he could say goodbye and share that moment with him when the rest of the family was there, as a demonstration that he was among one of the most important people in Hamilton's life. And she's apparently said that he was his best friend. So he was there when Hamilton died. He then had the task of going through Hamilton's papers and doing a first pass of organizing them for his family, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. He then had to sort of set the tone for responding, and he could have really saber-rattled and tried to whip up fury against Aaron Burr, and he didn't, both because he knew he was never a fan of mob violence. He had seen what it could do in France, and also he knew that Hamilton had a role in, a dueling act is not a one-person activity, and so he was not out to make Burr into a bad guy. And then he did give a lovely eulogy. And I give him a lot of credit for doing so in a way that is honest, because I'm sure we have all been to funerals where someone is giving remarks and you're like, that does not sound like the person that I knew at all. And I find that to be disingenuous. And I like the honesty with which Morris was handling his relationship with Hamilton and understanding his friend towards the end.
And Mrs. Hamilton, Eliza, as I understand it, said, "You have to help my children. You have to help this family out. We're destitute. We're in a desperate situation here. You are his close friend. Please, Mr. Morris, do what you can for us." Is that true?
Yeah, and I don't think she just necessarily meant money, because she had obviously come from a very wealthy family, so she could always return to the bosom of her father if she needed to. But I think that she meant more like be a father figure to her children and help with connections and the types of introductions and the type of guidance that was so, I mean, is still essential now, but was so essential in the 18th and early 19th century, when your connections and your relationships and your personal honor were currency. And so she wanted to make sure there was someone looking after her children and helping them along in the way that their father would have been expected to do.
Lindsay, why couldn't Jefferson and Gouverneur Morris get along? They're both highly educated gentlemen, well-read, men of the world who understand how diplomacy works, and they've traveled extensively. You would have thought that they would be able to be cordial and mutually respectful, which I suppose they were. But Morris later said, Jefferson doesn't suffer fools. He calls way too many fools. So that was his chief personal disagreement with Jefferson. I'm sure he didn't like Jefferson's politics very much, and vice versa. But why did they have such tension, do you think?
So I think that there were probably a couple of reasons. One, they both had very different and very similar life experiences, and yet took different things from them. So they both came from wealthy families. Morris was very committed to his military service, which produced a nationalism and a support for the federal government, which Jefferson did not share. And I think we've talked before about how I posit that one of the reasons that he had such a different view than a lot of the Federalists, it was this difference in terms of military service. One of the other things that was quite different about their lives is they were both in France when the French Revolution began, and they saw the early horrors of the beginnings of the Reign of Terror. Now, Jefferson left before it got to its peak bloodiness and before the king and queen were executed, but Morris was there the entire time. And so he just fundamentally could not understand why Jefferson was so blasé about the violence and remained so supportive about the French Revolution, because he had seen all of the horrible things that came with it. So I think it was, on one hand, that ideological component, but then it was also a personality component. I mean, Morris was warm and gregarious and outgoing and charming and clearly loved a good joke. We talked about his jokes in the first segment. Loved women in all of the ways, loved the salon women in Paris, was really sort of this vibrant joie de vivre person. And I think he probably
respected women. He had serious respect for women.
Yes. I think that he probably struck Jefferson as just way too much all of the time, not restrained enough, not disciplined enough. And he probably saw Jefferson as stiff and aloof and boring.
Well, here's how it played out, Lindsay, as far as I understand the story. Jefferson comes back just before the Reign of Terror, and he was planning to return to France, but he had been recruited to be Secretary of State, so fair enough. Morris is there at the end of Jefferson's tenure and stays on for a long time in Europe, not just in France. He saw the terror. He intervened to help certain people that he knew who were aristocrats who were being ground up by the terror. He was not afraid even to bribe in order to make that happen. It's impossible to regard Jefferson as being willing to bribe for that. They just have different styles. Jefferson is going to be much more play it by the book, much more aloof and detached. But Morris goes on to try to do everything he can to get Lafayette sprung from an Austrian prison and helps take care of Madame Lafayette during this incredibly difficult time in their lives. My admiration for him just soars when I see these stories that he was willing to work the system. And I don't think Jefferson would have even know how quite to work the system when it takes flattery and bribery and interventions at certain targeted moments. That's a savviness that Jefferson, I don't think, has and probably would not respect in himself. Thank goodness Morris was more flexible. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jefferson was obviously quite good at flattery when he wanted to be, but he saw that as a important diplomatic tool within sort of a box of options that were acceptable options. And bribery was not an acceptable option for a small r virtuous Republican. Whereas Morris kind of understood what we would think of as the real politique world of terror and war and what you had to do to get people out. He also tried to help save the king and queen. He tried to help them escape, which I think Jefferson probably would have been horrified by, but Morris was trying to create, I think he was initially supportive of the concept of a revolution, but of a much more moderate revolution. And he felt that the king was an important bulwark against the radical impulses which did indeed take over.
Well, Jefferson, as you know, was misunderstood the French Revolution and refused to ever back down. Although in the relationship with John Adams late in the correspondence, Jefferson makes the only real admission about this that he was ever going to make. And he basically says, you, John Adams, were right about the French Revolution, and I, Thomas Jefferson, was wrong about it. It had to cost Jefferson something to say that.
And you know that Adams was just like shrieking.
Yes, finally. But you know, too, that Jefferson touched up his correspondence late in life, and he actually changed some details in the Reign of Terror letters to make himself look less gullible and less naive about what actually happened. So he didn't do a lot of that in his life, but he did in this case because he realized that he had really exposed himself. And as a diplomat, he should have been able to understand where the French Revolution was going in a way that he just did not, because I think he let his romance with France and his idealism get in the way of sort of an unvarnished view of the world, which is a difference between them. I think Gouverneur Morris saw the world, he knew the way the world works, and it's not always pretty, and it's not always even honorable, but it is, and you deal with the world as you find it rather than a kind of fantasy agrarian world that you would like to create. And so I think he found Jefferson, as did John Adams, as did George Washington, a little too visionary at times and a little ungrounded from the real facts of life. And so you can see why they would have a hard time with each other. And then, of course, also, Morris becomes the American minister to France when Jefferson wanted his protege, William Short, to have that role. And Jefferson was deeply loyal to these proteges of his, and probably that poisoned him a little on Morris, too.
It did, and especially as the relationship with France then progressed and the Washington administration ended up signing the Jay Treaty, which Morris was very supportive of and Jefferson opposed. And so I think all of these other foreign policy elements conspired to shape their ongoing relationship.
So today, in our Me Too movement era, Morris is not going to fare very well. The diary is full of sexual conquest, let's call it that, or seduction, or liaisons, or, consensual relations, often with married women, often because they were married. He seemed to really enjoy that, especially while he was in France. I want to bring Rebecca Flynt back into this conversation. Rebecca, I've never read the diaries. I've read snippets. They're very expensive. Melanie Miller is a biographer of Gouverneur Morris and I think edited those diaries. They must be wonderful.
I have snippets of him. So Burkhauser, Richard Burkhauser wrote a book called The Rake Who Wrote the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris, and that's very good. Most of what I do, and I did this with my first book as well, the founders' archives are amazing. So and because he corresponded with all of the, a lot of the founding fathers that are in the archives, there's a lot of his letters and his things, he plays a big part in the archives. So no, I haven't actually, I've seen snippets of it, and his diary is absolutely amazing.
Can I specify, just for if anyone wants to go look at those, the website is founders.archives.gov, and it is a compilation hosted by the National Archives of all of the editorial projects of Franklin, Madison, Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, some from Jay. Anyway, they're amazing.
I think Monroe's, and they're searchable, which is amazing. You can search by period, you can search by author, you can search by, so if you have any information about when it was written or who was, you can search it that way, which I do a lot. And I just have stacks of printed out letters. But yeah, the snippets I've read from the diary are amazing because they 18th century tended to more flowery talk. Gouverneur was much more straightforward in his diary. He tended to put things, he used a lot of euphemisms and things like that, but he was pretty straightforward, which I really appreciate.
So what is your sort of exit analysis of John Randolph of Roanoke with respect to the stories that we're telling today? Do you despise him, or do you just find him fascinating, or both?
Oh, I think he was crazy. I think he was mad. I think he was an opium addict. I think he was an alcoholic. I think he was a very, very bitter man. I think he started out okay. I mean, it didn't seem, he had a pretty rough, they were orphaned. Those three boys were orphaned by the time they were, like 6. And St. George, their stepfather, really tried. And, and they came of age in an age when really the the great plantations were going broke, and he knew he would never, inhabit the world of his parents in terms of money and aristocracy. And then he had so many physical ailments, which of course were not his fault. And I think he just became bitter and so angry. And he was the last remaining son of John Randolph. And I think honestly, he didn't like Nancy to begin with, because I think she spurred him in the beginning. And to see her married to someone like Gouverneur Morris, I think just sent him over the edge in terms of, so I'm sympathetic to his upbringing and to the world he was born into, but I think he was really an unpleasant person. And he especially became, the opium addiction, the alcohol, the mental illness. I think, it's very sad. It's very sad. And he died a bitter, angry man, so it's very, very hard.
The part of this story that I find most interesting, and it's all interesting, it's just, it's like Peyton Place and Gone with the Wind combined into, and Dallas, the television program, wrapped into a bubble here. But the years that when she was forced to leave Virginia, or at least leave the Randolph properties, she is now a woman without much resource in the world, extremely vulnerable economically, vulnerable in all sorts of other ways. I wish we had a diary of hers from the day that John Randolph confronted her till the day that she made a marriage with Gouverneur Morris, because those had to be extremely difficult times. And I think I'm sure your novel will look at that period. When can we expect it out?
Hopefully, I'll finish it by the end of the year. Then, of course, revisions and edits and all those good things. So, possibly the end of 2025. Wow, that seems like a long way off, but that's realistic.
And what was your first book?
You're going to love this. It's titled American Harlot. And the subtitle is The Untold Story of Maria Reynolds.
Oh, boy. Here we go. Now you're getting closer to Lindsay territory. The Reynolds pamphlet, the Reynolds scandal. Lindsay, you get the last word. Tell us about the end of the life of Gouverneur Morris.
Well, Gouverneur Morris died in as colorful a fashion as he lived. He, towards the end of his life, as Rebecca said, he had a lot of gout. He had a lot of health issues. It appeared that he had a series of kidney stones, and he was having trouble passing one of them. And he was able to find a very slender whalebone, which were often used in corsets and other types of outfitting at the time, and inserted it as though it was a catheter.
Don't try that at home, everyone.
There was kidney stone stuck. That's where they get stuck, I'm told. And punctured himself, and it led to a fatal infection, and he died.
And the whalebone probably came from one of Nancy's corsets.
Wow. I hope so.
Yeah.
I love karma.
Yeah,
This is a great story. This is a terrible, awful story in every possible way. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.